She can peer into the memories of others, but each revelation brings her closer to the killer she once trusted. The Memory Merchant. Dublin. October rain lashed against the windows of the operating room, yet inside there was an almost unreal silence, broken only by the steady beeping of the monitors. Elizabeth Watson, a neurosurgeon with 20 years' experience, stood over a patient, a teenage boy injured in a car accident. Following King's protocol, she was using local stimulation under the drift method, short impulses in seizure-prone zones to prevent postoperative fits. When the micro-instrument touched a section of the temporal lobe, it was as if a switch had been thrown inside her head. An alien memory flared in her mind, sharp like a single frame of film. A cold evening. A boy in a yellow raincoat standing on a bridge, clutching a black umbrella to his chest. His face was hidden by the hood, but his trembling fingers clung to the fabric as if to salvation. The river roared below, and in the water something dark and unnaturally still could be seen. Elizabeth froze. In that vision, the rain drummed louder than in reality, and in its rhythm she thought she heard words forming, barely audible, as if they were never spoken aloud. "You didn't see this." She couldn't tell whether the phrase came from the memory itself or from somewhere deep in her own mind. The image vanished as abruptly as it had appeared. On the monitor, the patient's pulse spiked, the muscles in his face twitched. A microscopic reaction, a reflexive response to the touch on a memory zone. Elizabeth forced her focus back to the surgery, finished the stimulation, checked the vitals. Minutes later, the sutures were in place and the pulse had returned to normal. When the boy regained consciousness, he turned away from the bright light and, without knowing why, began to cry. The tears were silent, involuntary, as if caused by something impossible to remember. That evening, filling out her report, Elizabeth tried to describe the incident, but the words memory and phrase looked absurd in the notes column. She crossed them out, leaving the space blank. Outside, the rain was still falling, and she thought she could hear those same faint words in its noise again. For the first time in years, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the operating room's temperature. A week passed. Morning Dublin drowned in gray fog, and Elizabeth had nearly convinced herself that what had happened the previous Friday had been nothing more than fatigue. Until a new patient was wheeled into the operating room. A man in his 40s with a traumatic brain injury from a construction site fall. The medical history contained a detail. He had been a foreman renovating an old house near an abandoned playground in the city's north. That house had been marked condemned on the city map for decades. Scanning revealed a hematoma requiring urgent intervention. Elizabeth worked with full concentration until she reached the local stimulation stage. When the probe touched the entorhinal cortex, something burst inside her mind, a sudden flare of imagery. A summer day, the playground, the scent of hot metal from the slide and swings. Children laughing, but one boy stood apart, holding a battered doll. He lifted his eyes toward the second-floor window of a brick building. Behind the curtain's shadow, the silhouette of an adult hiding something long, wrapped in cloth. The light fell in such a way that the face was invisible. Elizabeth forced her hand to steady, noted the contact coordinates in her notebook next to her entry on the previous case. Suddenly, the memory jerked like a broken reel of film and was gone. In reality, the man inhaled sharply, the muscles in his face twitching faintly. In recovery, still under anesthesia, he mumbled incoherently. Elizabeth leaned closer and caught. They said we didn't see anything. The plural rang in her mind like an alarm. Not one person, a group. That evening, she reopened her notebook. The bridge, the umbrella, the dark figure in the water, the playground, the window, the wrapped object. And now, the foreman, who had worked where all of this might have happened. She felt these were fragments of a single chain, and someone had once made sure the links would never align into a whole. Between surgeries, Elizabeth shut herself in her office and plunged into the archives. She began with the medical histories of her two recent patients. Age, professions, surroundings, different. But in their childhood medical records, she found a match. Both had once been registered at a pediatric clinic on Dublin's outskirts, in the same neighborhood. Searching for context, she dug into old conference materials. Among the scanned documents was a poster from nearly 20 years ago. Drift mapping for epileptic foci. Author, Professor Lawrence King. The method involved briefly activating long-term memory when probing certain brain regions. The description claimed the stimulus produced a memory flare before deactivating it. Elizabeth remembered training under King's protocol, but she had always worked at a cleaner amplitude than recommended. Perhaps that was why she was sensitive to such bursts. Switching to the clinic's paper journals, she spotted a name she knew from internal correspondence: Ronan Cross, senior archivist. Records handled by him bore odd gaps: deleted lines in logs, mismatched dates for scheduled checkups, duplicate charts for the same child. To confirm, she turned to city news archives. Instead of a continuous, clean history, she found discrepancies. One edition reported the opening of a new pediatric ward in June, but another, with the same date, recorded an evacuation due to an incident without details. Police logs from the same period had entire weeks missing. These breaks looked less like coincidence than like a deliberately constructed shadow. And in that shadow, she now saw two figures: her mentor, whose method had unwittingly let her uncover other people's memories, and the archivist, who could erase entire fragments of events from reality. Elizabeth realized chance was unlikely. Someone had spent years not merely hiding the truth, but slicing it out of people's minds and the record, so it could never again form a complete story. Elizabeth turned to the one person who might know more about such phenomena: Professor Lawrence King, her mentor and the creator of the DRI method. His office was in the old wing of the university clinic, windows opening onto an ivy-choked courtyard. King greeted her with his usual polite half-smile, gesturing to a chair. "Liz, you have the look of someone who's come too close to a line better left uncrossed." She began with neutral questions about drift and potential side effects. King, rolling a silver pen between his fingers, replied evenly. The technique was a tool, and like any tool, in the wrong hands it could harm. He recalled a case from his practice: a child who, after a traumatic episode, was rewritten, stopped stuttering, and no longer slept with a nightlight. But, he added, sometimes, along with the pain, goes a piece of what makes a person themselves. She listened, wondering if he was speaking about more than medical ethics. When King stood to retrieve an old neuropsychology volume, the reflection in the bookcase glass briefly showed a photograph: a group of children by a river, dark silhouettes against brick buildings. The light shifted, and the image vanished before she could focus. The talk yielded no direct answers, only cautious warnings and the sense that he had seen more than she yet knew. At the door, King paused, looking past her shoulder, and said quietly, "Night shifts. Rain on the quay. pediatric crisis, some scenes don't fade. Elizabeth left with the feeling she had gained something, not facts, but strokes on a portrait of a man whose past might hold more shadows than she was ready to admit. Elizabeth's work now resembled investigation more than medicine. She called former patients, formally inquiring about their recovery, unofficially asking about strange dreams or images they might have seen. The mosaic formed slowly. One man spoke of the smell of wet wool and splashing water, a woman of a sharp cry on a bridge that went instantly silent in her head, another of a heavy bundle hidden under a tarp. Elizabeth called this a cognitive shard, an identical defect in memory occurring in several people after the same sudden stress. Piecing the data together, she saw the outline of an event, but without a killer's mask. Instead of a face, this story had coordinates of a systemic error. That night, 30 years ago, at the pediatric clinic, experimental sedation was being administered to a boy in uncontrollable epileptic status. The protocol failed. Sudden respiratory arrest, panic among staff, an attempt to rush him to the main hospital, rain, a bridge over the river, and a lifeless body in the water. Reports framed it as an accident, but for those present, it was a catastrophe that could destroy reputations and careers. Someone decided the memory must be cut and redistributed, so that no single witness could recall the entire truth. Evidence pointed in several directions. The foreman from her second case had access to the old bridge and kept rolls of tarp like one witness described. Archivist Ronan Cross handled journals with erased lines, the blank spaces coinciding with the K incident. She still didn't know who had made the decision to slice the witnesses' memories, but she had a map now, places, dates, people, and knew the final fragment lived in the mind of one person, someone close enough for her to reach. The patient was Professor Lawrence King, officially a hippocampal tumor requiring urgent surgery. Elizabeth knew this was her only chance to get the missing piece. He agreed without protest, but in his eyes was something like a challenge and readiness for a duel. The operating room was perfectly still, broken only by the deep rhythm of the machines. Lamplight fell on King's motionless face beneath the ventilator mask. Elizabeth worked methodically, moving from zone to zone. Each drift stimulus brought a new burst, image fragments, scents, scraps of sound. Night, rain on the bridge, a figure in a soaked coat dragging a tarp-wrapped bundle across wet asphalt. When the cloth slipped, a child's hand emerged. But in this vision, King's face did not show cold intent. His lips were pale, his hands shaking, gagging in his throat. He was trying to resuscitate the boy right there on the wet concrete, but failed. A voice, hers or his, echoed in her mind. Sometimes memory kills faster than a knife. In the next fragment, King stood in the clinic corridor, surrounded by crying nurses. He looked at the group of child witnesses and seemed to make a decision. His face hardened, not from malice, but from choice. Days later, he used drift to slice their memories and scatter the fragments among different people, not for gain, but to prevent vigilante justice and the collapse of the department. Elizabeth kept working, emotionless hands steady. She logged every stimulation parameter, every impulse and brain response, making a duplicate copy to an external drive. When it was over, King lived, but his gaze no longer held its former power. He knew she had seen it all. Now she had more than images, a technically captured pattern, evidence she could present. She had pulled from the shadow of the past something that had once been erased. The case of the boy's disappearance 30 years ago surfaced quietly in the news. Police reports used a dry phrase, "death by negligence, followed by obstruction of justice." The name was withheld, officially for reasons of time-lapse and medical confidentiality. For most Dubliners, it was just another line in the newsfeed, but for Elizabeth, it was the end of an investigation that still left her with unanswered questions. She sat in her office, looking at the empty frame where a graduation photo once stood, she and King side by side. Now, the glass reflected only her face and a blurred silhouette beyond the window. She didn't turn. She knew no one was there, or at least shouldn't be. That evening, a small envelope lay at her door, no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper with uneven handwriting. "You see more clearly because you do not excuse." Nothing more. No date, no signature. Elizabeth slipped the note into her desk drawer. She felt no urge to hand it over to the police. The meaning was too personal to place in other hands. From that day on, she never saw such vivid bursts of others' memories in the operating room. But sometimes, on rainy evenings, as drops beat their steady rhythm on the sill, brief images would surface: a child's face, the gleam of wet asphalt, the rustle of cloth. They vanished as quickly as they appeared, leaving a faint tremor in her chest. The gift had not gone. It had retreated inward, waiting for the next brush with the unseen line. And Elizabeth knew, the past cannot be cut away without leaving a trace. It always finds its way back, in the whisper of rain, in the reflection of glass, in a glance that lingers a moment too long.